Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody. Welcome to my YouTube channel and to another layout design video. This has been a very interesting design project for me in many ways. Here is the railroad site that I was given to start with. It is part of a much larger basement. When the client first wrote to me, he said he had a very large basement that he wanted to use partially for model railroad. He didn't want to allocate the entire space to it. And he had outlined an area approximately 15 feet by 22 that he thought might be a good location for it. But this was not a hard and fast limit. This was just what he thought might be good enough to start with. At first, the client didn't really know exactly what he wanted in a railroad, but he did complete my questionnaire, and that helped to get him thinking. And we also had several phone calls, during which we refined the goals for the railroad. Now, as I mentioned, he said he had a large basement. Here is the full basement site, and the area bordered by the red line is what I had on the opening screen. As always with all layout designs, I start by figuring out what footprints will work. After a little bit of experimentation, this is what I came up with as being the ideal footprint for this kind of site. The client had told me that there were some services along the ceiling in this area of the benchwork which he wanted to keep accessible, hence the need for a narrow access aisle down this side. And although that requirement was eventually eliminated, by that point in the design process we'd already settled on putting staging yards in this area, and this access aisle was therefore going to be very useful for other reasons anyway, so we ended up keeping it. Now, although this is an efficient layout footprint for the space, you may notice that it doesn't quite fit. I had to go a little bit beyond the original 15-foot wide area, which is this red chain dotted line, because the two turnback curves were not going to fit side by side with sensible R widths and the curve radius that he wanted. The client did want the availability to run any kind of equipment, including full-length passenger cars, big boys and things like that. This yellow wall over the left side of the plan represents an internal partition wall that is already built in the space, and that portion of the basement is finished as a family room. And the door location was far enough north that we were able to stretch this site slightly. So here it is with the adjustment made, adding 2 feet, so we're now at 17 feet wide. And now everything fits quite well. Now, the kind of layout that the guy had decided that he wanted, it wasn't going to fit all on one deck. The guy wanted a nice operating layout, but he also wanted a lot of open main line running. So we discussed the possibility of a 3-deck layout with all the operational areas in the middle and scenic runs top and bottom. So here is the lower level. We start from a staging yard, run through the visible portion of the railroad. There's a helix hidden in this turnback curve, and we have the middle deck with a yard, an engine terminal and some industries. Back to the helix again, and then the upper deck running round to another staging yard directly over the lower one, with return loops at both ends of the main line above and below the helix, meaning that this 6-foot diameter area in this corner actually gets very well used. Now, there were some problems with this design. For one thing, all the staging tracks are a little bit on the short side for the train length we were aiming for at this point. And for another, the client was concerned that he might have given me too much space along the north edge. He does have his furnace and other utilities further off to the north, and he wasn't sure if we were leaving quite enough space at this point. But let's take a diversion back to the full basement plan again. We're in this area here, and there is quite a lot of unused space in this bottom corner under the bay window. And at this point the client gave me permission to expand into this area. So let's go back to the design. Note the problem we have at the moment is with these two end curves side by side being too wide. By expanding into this alcove, we no longer have an end curve in this location, allowing the northern one to be moved south slightly. The red chain dotted line is still in the same place as it was on the last design, but now we can see that we've moved a foot from it at this end and 2 feet from it along the rest of the run. So not only does that give the client a little more space where he was concerned about there being enough, but we now have a much longer straight run. So this now becomes a good space for a main yard, and the staging yards have been extended significantly. And all we've done is expanded into this corner of the basement, which really wasn't going to be used for anything else anyway. Now this wasn't quite the end of the shenanigans with figuring out the shape of the site to use. It actually took us quite a long time to get the shape of this alcove right, because there are electrical panels and all sorts of other hardware around this alcove, which ate up some space. And as I said, it took us a while to figure out how much space we had available there. Here is a later drawing. The orange boxes represent all the electrical stuff. They're clearly not right at the moment, although at this stage in the process we did feel that point X, which was the most critical point on the plan, was in about the right place. And we decided we were going to leave a minimum of 3 feet of walking space all the way around there. You'll notice that now that we can't go quite as far into this alcove, this section of the benchwork is now straight, which actually is better anyway. Not only is it going to be a lot easier to build it, but we have more room in the alcove for a work area and a DCC cabinet. I drew a crew lounge in this corner, thinking there was room for it, but as it turns out this area here is occupied by the client's furnace, so obviously it's not available for a crew lounge. But the dimensions we have right now, with this southern peninsula being where it is, and with the northern one being 23 feet long, we end up with 4 feet of space around the furnace on both sides. So there's plenty of elbow room in there. Here is a later drawing with the alcove corrected. The client had sent me some photographs of the alcove, and I was able to work out where we were going wrong, and I'm fairly confident that these utilities in this area are now drawn in the correct places. Originally we were only going to leave 3 feet at the end of the room for a walkway, but at this point the client was talking about his original Lionel train set that he had as a child and which got him started in model railroads. It turned out that he still had it in his possession, and he still had a soft spot for it in his heart. So we decided to shorten the railroad by a foot to allow space for a display cabinet along this wall, to display, among other things, his Lionel train set. This drawing is still wrong in one detail. It's the furnace which is here, not the HVAC. The HVAC is further north. Also at this point, the client talked a little more about his ideals for different modes of running trains. Although a proper operating layout was important to him, he also liked to sit back and enjoy the railroad in what he called wine mode, where he would just sit and watch it while sipping on some wine. So every iteration of the plan from this point to the end was drawn with the inclusion of wine loops in mind. The goal is to ensure that on each level, as much of the main line as possible is incorporated into separate continuous circuits. This is the lower level, and junction X is the point at which the end-to-end main line runs towards the helix, and the other route loops around the outside and connects up with the end of the staging yard, forming a continuous loop. If we move now to the middle level, we can see that the helix from the lower level arrives at the end of this intermediate staging yard, runs through the visible portion again in the same direction, and the yard lead extends around the outside and connects up as a continuous circuit, while the end-to-end main line continues around the inside and up a second helix to the third level. The reason for wanting to include staging on all 3 levels is that the client had said that he wanted the ability to be able to run trains from other periods outside of his normal operating sessions. So although the whole layout will be designed as a transition area railroad, he wanted to be able to run more modern trains on occasion. So the extra staging yards on each level provide somewhere for him to park those out of the way of the normal operating trains. On this level, the second helix from the middle level arrives at another 6-track staging yard, runs through that before arriving on the upper scenic level. And here is the upper scenic level. The main line runs through the route twice, looping back on itself before arriving in the upper staging yard. while there is a connection from this junction Z directly above junction X on the lower level, forming a continuous loop around the outside and connecting up with the mezzanine staging that I showed you earlier. Let's go back, here it is, there's the connection. So now we've got 4 staging yards stacked in the same space, larger ones at each end of the main line and smaller ones between them for any anachronistic trains that he wants to collect. Anyway, now that the concept for the railroad has been pretty well defined, now I'm going to go back through all the levels in turn and start filling in details. I went back to the lower level and decided there was room for a nice long passing siding in the middle of the railroad, and this run along the north edge was crying out to be used for a spectacular scenery area. So I suggested building something inspired by the Willsboro Bay scene on the club layout of the Polytechnic Institute in New York somewhere. It's appeared on the cover as Model Railroader quite frequently, so older viewers should know what I mean, even if I can't say the name. I've also fleshed out the staging yard, working out exactly how many tracks we can fit, and those of you who've watched my layout designs before will know that I always squeeze in as much staging as I possibly can. Hence the auxiliary stub-ended staging tracks in this area. Here is the middle level. At this point we've decided that we're going to put a freight yard down this side of the central aisle and a passenger station down the other side with a small engine terminal in the corner. And we decided that the north side of the railroad is going to be a paper mill. Note that I'm also filling in the elevations at this point. And my normal starting point for a 3-level layout is to have datum levels at 24, 44 and 64 inches. Here's the mezzanine level. I've set the mezzanine staging at 58 inches, knowing that the staging yard above it will be considerably higher than the datum for the upper level. Here's the upper level. You can see that most of the lower loop is at 64 inches. We've got to drop slightly here to be able to get down to the mezzanine staging, and then we'll climb up around this spiral, and most of the top loop is at 72 inches before dropping back down to 70 for the staging yard. It does mean that a step stool will be required for access to the upper staging yard, but that's not a problem. Here is a later version of the lower level with the Willsboro Bay scene filled in, although it's been renamed to Brewer Bay, and the passing siding on the lower level has now been developed into a fully fledged switching town. The client decided that he wanted more of a way freight operation than was available just on the middle level. And we also decided that the area under the freight yard was a good spot for a large trestle. We would have a small one in the Brewer Bay scene, and this was a good opportunity for a much larger one. Here I've fleshed out the middle level. The paper mill is still just a basic placeholder, but I've worked out what sort of track arrangements are possible in the passenger terminal and the freight yard, and also added quite a lot of industrial spurs around this end, hooked up to the yard lead track. Now, although this is primarily a single track main line, most of the middle deck is double tracked, and it's effectively just a very long passing siding with crossovers. The intention is to make it look like a double track main line without the complexity of a true double track. At most points, the mainline tracks serve multiple purposes. For example, at this point, the rear main also serves one track of the passenger terminal, and the front track, labelled here the freight main, is also the yard lead for this end of the yard. Since he's going to be operating with a fairly small crew, I didn't feel the need for dedicated yard leads at both ends. We have one at this end, so most of the switching is going to be done from this end of the yard. I felt we didn't also need one at the other end. And here is the next iteration of the upper level. I've improved the spatial effects at this end by overlapping the two end loops instead of trying to keep the upper one wholly inside the lower one, and putting the lower track through a tunnel over part of the curve. And that gives us a lot more space in this area. The previous version was very cramped at this end. So where the tracks cross over each other, I've put a scene here with two stacked bridges, which was something the client suggested, which he had seen some time ago, I think probably in a Model Railroader magazine or something like that. Now, the area above the helix is probably confusing to most of my viewers. I've managed to find a way of putting an additional connection in here so that both laps of the main line through the scenic section are now on separate continuous circuits. So there is a connection from the end of the upper staging yard down around the inside of the upper reversing loop and then ducking under it and connecting up where the 67 is, forming a fourth continuous circuit, which the client was very pleased with. Up until now he thought he was only going to get 3. And then I did a similar thing on the middle level. Crossover 0 used to be a single turnout, but now we have a second main line extending around the back. The continuous circuit around here still connects up with the 6-track middle staging yard. And then there is an additional curved turnout at this point just before the helix and another 4-track staging yard running through here. And that connects up with the extra main line that I showed you earlier. Now the reason for cutting this back to only 4 tracks instead of 6 is twofold. Firstly, there isn't a huge amount of vertical separation between middle staging 1 and 2. So by cutting this back, there is better access to the yard that is just below it. And secondly, I'm going to need some control panels in this area. So by cutting this back by 2 tracks gives a 4-inch open space at the front, allowing for some vertical control panels for the various staging yards. So with all those modifications, the client now has 5 wind loops instead of just 3. In the next iteration of the upper deck, we have split the backdrop at this point to give us room for a deeper scene, allowing the inclusion of a cable car scene from behind this passenger station up to the top of this snow-covered peak. That was something the client had asked for earlier, and we weren't sure if we were going to be able to include it. Anyway, at this point in the design, the customer is very happy that he's getting a lot of railroad in his space. The biggest problem we have with the design at the moment is on the middle level. If we go back to that, we can see the passenger terminal is very cramped. There isn't really a lot of space for it. And the client asked whether an extra foot of space would make any difference. Obviously thinking of the possibility of straightening out this side to open it out a bit. So here is what I drew. That extra foot makes a lot of difference to the passenger terminal. And we also have the option of adding a lot more switching opportunities for head-end cars on his passenger trains. Now this was something that I wasn't necessarily proposing that we do, I just wanted to see what was possible in the space. But we ultimately decided to cut this back a little bit. At this point, the only part of the railroad that really hasn't been developed at all is the paper mill. And actually I'm glad I left it till the end, because I would have had to have completely redesigned it once the shape of the benchwork changed. This version of the design stayed on the drawing board for several weeks because the client wasn't sure whether he wanted to give up that extra space to improve the passenger terminal or whether go back to the original shape and cram it in. Although eventually he decided that we would actually give ourselves the extra foot of space. So now that the footprint has been finalised, it's time to start going through all the levels again and putting all the finishing touches to the plan. Here is the lower level with all the structures and scenic details filled in. We've decided on a deep quarry in this corner, and although I've shown the pit with water at the bottom, more than likely the bottom won't need modelling because it'll be impossible to see it. It'll just be a high back rock wall dropping down below the line of sight. I've added another pair of spurs curving off through the backdrop, and this represents an offstage industry, and its main purpose is to provide additional car capacity so that the client has the option of running a local freight turn from the main yard down to this town and having enough car spots to justify this dedicated train. Here is the middle level. The paper mill has now finally been filled in. I removed 3 of the spurs in this area and then ended up putting 1 of them back. The engine terminal has now been fleshed out with all the details, and we see the option of extending the roundhouse further around the end of the turntable. Although the roundhouse itself will crash into the backdrop, all the stall tracks can extend under the backdrop and still be full length. So we end up with a much larger capacity in the engine terminal. Even though it's still only a small terminal, a 90-foot turntable and roundhouse, because the vast majority of locomotives serviced will be for local trains. The long distance through trains would just drop off blocks of cars or make brief stops at the passenger terminal. They won't actually change power. So most of the locomotives serviced are going to be 280s, Pacifics and switchers. For the industries along the back of the freight yard, I selected just 4 industries, one fairly small one with a single spur, and then 3 much larger ones with multiple car spots in each. Rail-served industries do tend to be a lot larger than most modelers realise. So it's always worth finding space for some big industries on a model railroad if you possibly can. There's still some white space at the end of this peninsula that we haven't filled in yet, because at this point we weren't quite sure what to put there. And if we notice in the top right corner of the plan, there are a couple of sections cut through the railroad, section A at this point and section B through this peninsula here. And the client said that was very helpful in allowing him to visualize how the railroad would look in 3D. At this point the station is behind the tracks. We decided to experiment with a variation with it over the tracks. Here it is. It's the same building turned through 90 degrees and with a forecourt in front of it. And it does tend to give the passenger terminal the appearance of a larger facility than it really is. So we decided to go with this version. And also in this view, we can see I've added one more industrial spur to a fuel dealer, which would have been very common in the period being modelled, and I'd realised that so far I hadn't shown one on the railroad. So now we have that. Here is the upper level with the scenery filled in, and I particularly like this scene along the top edge with the 2 main lines both paralleling the river, which meanders quite a bit in a shallow valley. The river here is only going to be about an inch or so below the lower track, contrasting with the tall cliffs on the lower level. And this is the last of the 3 scenes that the client is going to see when he's on his exercise bike, because the home gym is just to the north of this area. So when he's working out, he'll set trains to run on each continuous circuit and watch them go past periodically while he's riding the exercise bike. The other thing that has changed in this version is that we now have a much larger mine. Here is another version of the upper level, eliminating the double-sided backdrop on the northern peninsula and instead going with a view blocking ridge. And it's fairly easy to do since the upper track is already above eye level, so we only have to go a few inches higher to ensure that you can't see the other side. And instead of having the big hole in the middle, we've now got a hidden access opening completely covered by the mountain, from which he will be able to get to the upper cable car station if it ever needs cleaning or servicing. In the next view, I'm showing one way of using this space around the end curve. I've added some city streets above track level. And here is another version without the roads and with green belt instead. We haven't totally decided which version we're going to go with yet. Personally, I like the road system. I think it breaks up the end better and adds more interest, although the client is leaning towards the open green belt view. So at least for the time being, this is the final version. Here is the final version of the upper level with all the annotations removed. I forgot to mention earlier, there's a scene here that the client liked on a railroad that I built many years ago, which had a low trestle crossing a lake with a causeway in front of it. There will be several culverts through the causeway, but I wasn't quite sure how to show them on a small scale 2-dimensional drawing. And then finally, here is a clean version of the lower level. And normally this is where I would sign off, but this layout design got even more interesting at this point, and the client paid me to spend extra time creating a 3D rendition of it. So before I sign off, let's just take a look at that.